back. Joining me today is editor at Mother Jones and author of the forthcoming book called Trigger Points. Please welcome Mark Follman. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm really good. I'm glad you're joining us today. This is your first time on the Daily Beans, though we have reported on some of your investigation into what we're going to talk about today, because we've been following it, right? And this is, the big story from that was this, cache of weapons across the Potomac in a DC hotel. And we've been following that very closely. But today you wrote a piece with Dan Friedman from Mother Jones about evidence that continues to emerge, showing that this was actually an armed insurrection in the face of a lot of congressional Republicans who claim otherwise, even though, and I want to be clear, a firearm isn't required for there to be an armed insurrection. But if we're going to go by their definition, we have evidence of that coming out in court filings. Can you briefly tell us about your first piece from the end of September, and then what's new today that you're reporting?
Yeah, so just to kind of give you the big picture, there's this kind of bigger narrative war going on about the January 6th insurrection, right, in politics, and this widespread and concerted attempt to essentially cover it up, bury it, whitewash it by the Republican Party and Trump allies and Fox News and the whole crew, right? So for really since the beginning, since it happened back in January, there's been this constant sort of talk about how, oh, it was a tourist visit, one congressman said, and this was no big deal, and there was a few bad apples. I mean, they've tried really sort of every kind of trick in the book. Well, a key claim among those that narrative that they've been spinning ever since January 6th is that there were no guns at the Capitol. And as you pointed out, there were all kinds of weapons there. I mean, we've all seen the video, right? There were hockey sticks and baseball bats and chemical spray. There was all kinds of violence going on there. Horrible, horrible day in American history. But there were also guns. And that's another part of this kind of big lie about the 2020 election and what's happened since. And so we started to focus on this with our investigative reporting a few months ago, as we started to see bits of evidence about firearms, in particular the Oath Keepers alleged conspiracy case that you mentioned, where there was allegedly this group from this far-right militia organization that brought a whole stockpile of guns to a hotel just outside of downtown DC. And then there were a number of other cases that were coming up as the Justice Department and FBI started arresting hundreds of people for their participation in the events of January 6th, right? And within those cases, we started to see evidence of guns on the Capitol grounds that day among some people who were arrested, and then other people connected to the events of that day.
Yeah, and some of the things that are coming out more recently since your reporting on September 30th, which is what you're kind of covering in this new piece, is a defendant named Brown. Can you tell us a little bit about him? I mean, not an ordinary defendant here. Well, I shouldn't say that. There were a lot of U.S. veterans and some congressional candidates at the insurrection, but he is a former military and also a former U.S. congressional candidate, or U.S. congressional candidate, or Florida congressional candidate.
For U.S. Congress, correct? Yeah, I believe it was Florida's 14th district. So, right. I mean, there's in a kind of overarching sense, there are two sort of categories of people I think that you could talk about who were involved in January 6th. And we're talking about there were hundreds and if not thousands of people on the Capitol grounds that day as this was all going down. I think it was estimated to be about 800 who actually went in the Capitol building itself, but there were many, many more, thousands on the grounds in this mob. There were a lot of people who were, I think, what you might characterize as sort of ordinary Americans, ordinary citizens, right, who had been caught up in this mass delusion, these lies about the 2020 election. But then there were also, these subsets of people who were, had more, I think, what you might call specialized backgrounds, people from law enforcement or the military, whether active duty or veterans. There are actually quite a few in the mix, as we've learned over time with these hundreds of cases of people arrested. And so the person you're talking about is just the latest. This person, Jeremy Brown from Florida, is another self-identified Oath Keeper, part of this militia organization. There are dozens of folks affiliated with that group who were involved in January 6th, and a number of them were arrested and charged in this ongoing conspiracy case that's been pretty high profile. That's part of this story. But this latest case came on our radar because this member from Florida, who was a longtime Special Forces veteran from the U.S. Army, interesting case, has no criminal history, as the judge noted in a recent detention ruling, and had served honorably in the military. But here he is with these sort of radicalized views of taking on the U.S. government, and he, like other oath keepers, according to FBI evidence provided in these criminal complaints, planned and communicated with others about going to Washington for January 6th, brought guns with him, according to the government, did not bring those guns to the Capitol. The FBI complaint says that he left them with some unidentified individuals in Virginia. So we don't know if it connects necessarily to that other Oath Keepers case that's ongoing. But yeah, this was a person who, you look at his history and then you look at what he sort of became in his alleged actions, and it's quite interesting and frankly disturbing to see what came of it.
Yeah, and I think he was looking for, wasn't he looking for, him and his lawyers looking for pretrial release? But the judge, I think, had other ideas. Talk a little bit about that, because from my understanding, this isn't his only issue, right? There's some other things going on in Florida with threats to law enforcement or something.
Right. So the government alleges that, and this is an interesting sort of development in his case, where he was identified on Capitol grounds and was facing charges in the district court in D.C. for disorderly conduct and being on Capitol grounds unlawfully, like everyone else who was there that day, who's been charged. But then further investigation in Florida, the federal agents say in this complaint against him there in the Middle District of Florida that they found a number of weapons in his home, including unregistered firearms, a sawed-off shotgun, and a kind of semi-automatic rifle that would need to be registered under federal law, military-grade hand grenades. And then there was also, so in this recent detention hearing where these details were coming out, the judge was also looking at evidence of a sign he had allegedly posted on his home, kind of in the view of prosecutors threatening law enforcement agencies, the FBI and others, saying essentially, I think the line on it was, you better bring a bigger tactical package, meaning apparently, if you're going to come arrest me, you're going to need more force. So the judge ruled that he viewed that as a threat, and that between that and the weapons in the home and this person's military background, that he was too dangerous to release. So he's currently remaining in jail pending his trial. There are a number of cases like this related to January 6th, people who, even afterwards, as this story was really unfolding in the press and with the government starting to work this sprawling set of cases, people who were, still bragging about what they'd done and threatening to do more, making threats about violence in the future, in some cases having firearms in their home in violation of pretrial orders from a judge. So there's this whole issue too of this ongoing danger or ongoing threat from people who still apparently believe in these lies about the election and about the government, and are perhaps thinking of doing more. January 6th was not an isolated event in that sense. This is very much an ongoing story, in my view.
Yeah, and in your article here from Mother Jones, you say that there are other ongoing developments, and I want to ask you about those, and I also want to ask you about your book, because that kind of ties into what we're talking about. But I do have to take a quick break. Will you stay with me?
Sure.
Everybody, welcome back. We are talking with an editor at Mother Jones who dropped a piece today, also author of the forthcoming book, Trigger Points, Mark Follman. And Mark, before the break, I had hinted at some further developments that you cover in this piece that came out today, particularly including issues related to Samsul and Joe Biggs. Listeners should be familiar with those names by now. Can you tell us about what you're learning in those two particular cases?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's worth also pointing out that, this picture of firearms that we've been developing in connection with January 6th, it's pretty broad based, right? There's a variety of cases of these kind of far-right groups and conspiracy cases that this ties into. And then there's some individuals too who've had evidence of guns or facing weapons charges. in relation to January 6th. And the latest to come on our radar as we've looked into this includes a case of a guy named Ryan Samsul, who you mentioned, who was charged with assaulting police, among other things, at the Capitol, and is not apparently affiliated with the Proud Boys, but did interact, as we know from footage that's been on social media, did interact with Joe Biggs, who's one of the leaders of the Proud Boys group. And so it came out in a recent court filing that Samsul apparently told FBI investigators that Biggs had a gun at the Capitol, that he flashed it at him as he was urging him to basically confront the police defending the Capitol grounds. Biggs denies this, or his lawyer denied this in a New York Times report, said that these allegations are false. Biggs is not facing gun charges. But this is just, I think, emblematic of a lot of the things we're finding coming up in these cases now, where you see these details that suggest a lot more people may have been armed. It's hard to know definitively. There's not enough evidence for them to be charged, apparently. There may be, we don't know. But this also aligns with something else that we reported on in this series of stories, which is that you have testimony from law enforcement agents who were involved in January 6th, dealing with this on the grounds and surrounds of the Capitol, who have all said that they believe that there were quite a lot of firearms among this crowd in backpacks and stashed, concealed carry situations. And they felt that they couldn't do anything about it. They were terribly outnumbered. And they were also very worried, according to their testimony, that if they were more aggressive with these armed extremists, or these suspected armed extremists, that they would set off this just perilous violence in which, it was not going to go well for anyone, and especially not for them. So ultimately, we won't know how many guns were there, but we know that there were far more than zero. And we're seeing more and more of this coming out.
Yeah, and it's shocking almost that this did not turn into a mass casualty event because of what is being uncovered as time goes by, thanks to reporting like yours in Mother Jones. I really recommend everybody follow you on Twitter at Mark Follman, Mark with a K, Follman, Follman. And speaking of mass shootings,
I just want to say too that I think you're right about that point. I mean, it can't be emphasized enough. This event was on the precipice of something just far, far worse. And I'm not sure that a lot of the public appreciates that. And that's part of this war for the narrative that's ongoing, right? That, oh, this was no big deal, or it was sort of a tourist event or whatever. A lot of people are buying that. But if you look closely at these criminal cases, dozens, even hundreds of criminal cases, if you look at the footage from that day, if you listen to the testimony, this could have, I mean, as dark as it was a terrible day in American history. People died. A lot of people got hurt. We watched the foundation of our democracy being shaken. But as you say, this could have been a mass attack, easily, an event of mass violence, in part because a lot of people were armed.
Yeah, and then on the other side, how close we came to people like Jeffrey Clark and John Eastman, and people in the Oval Office, including Donald Trump, how close they came to being able to just have Pence throw out electors for certain states, 7 specific states, and try to do it that way. This is a multiple front attack.
Right.
And
I think you started with the bloodless coup attempt, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened after that was the beginning of a bloody coup attempt.
Yeah, agreed. And speaking of these kind of mass casualty events, you have a book coming out that's available for pre-order. You can, there's a link in your Twitter bio, and it's called Trigger Points. And it's the inside story of specialized teams of forensic psychs, FBI agents, and teams that stop mass shootings and are stopping mass shootings. Can you tell us about, it comes out in April, but again, as I said, you can pre-order it now and get your copy. And tell us what prompted you to write this book, and sort of, how it ties into, I mean, right now, the gun violence problem in America, as evidenced in what we're seeing in January 6th unfold, but just, in general, and I'm wondering if that's sort of what prompted you to get on this book.
Yeah, well, I'm very excited about Trigger Points coming out soon. I've been working on this book for years. In some sense, I started it almost a decade ago when I began focusing in large part on mass shootings, the problem of mass shootings in the United States. And I built a database on them. It was one of the first kind of public databases of these attacks, and started hearing about this method of prevention called behavioral threat assessment, which at the time, this is back in 2013, was very little known, hadn't really been written about. I did a story on it for Mother Jones in 2015 for our magazine. And the more that I learned about it and looked into it, the more I was seeing that this was a really interesting and potentially very powerful strategy and method for dealing with this problem beyond the gun debate, which is an important debate. We all are, I think, familiar with the contours of it, and it's an ongoing, very intense discussion that I think has taken a lot of time to make progress on. And I think it's also very frustrating for a lot of people. And that's one of the things that inspired me to really go deep on this subject and write a book about it, because here, over here is this whole other solution, potential solution that people really don't know about, and I think should. So I started getting to know some of the pioneers of this field and leading practitioners, and learning about cases where they were stopping attacks. And it's very interesting territory, because you don't know in a certain sense that you've actually stopped an attack if one doesn't occur. But on the other hand, there are many, many threat cases where there was a high level of danger in the view of these experts. And these are collaborative groups of primarily mental health and law enforcement experts. And depending on the setting, in school systems, you're talking about educators and school counselors and psychologists. In the corporate world, you have HR directors and security people of that nature. There's a lot of this going on in the government, in the federal government and state governments. So these groups of experts work together in a multidisciplinary capacity to essentially intervene and get help to people who need it before they go down what they call this pathway to violence, which is planning and carrying out targeted attacks. And that's what mass shootings are. Part of what I do in the book is I debunk some of these big myths that we have about this problem. One is this idea that people snap and that they're all crazy, mass shooters. That's just not true. All of these cases, to some degree, more in some than others, but in all cases, to some degree, are planned. And because they're planned, there is an opportunity to intervene before that plan is carried out. So it's a matter of learning the behavioral warning signs and intervening in constructive ways to try to stop it. And that's what the book's really all about.
And I think we've seen in the media some cases of mass shootings being foiled using behavioral threat assessment techniques. And so, I hopefully, as we in parallel fight, for common sense gun laws, hopefully we can apply other solutions as well and come at it from multiple fronts.
That's right. I see it very much as an additive solution to sensible regulation and other aspects of the issue. This is a very complex problem, and a complex problem, surprise, surprise, requires complex solutions, right? So while the discussion and the debate over gun regulations is very important, it's not the only aspect of this problem that needs to be addressed. And I think that there's a lot of promise and hope in this other work. I've seen it firsthand. I've spent time with threat assessment teams working cases successfully. I write about those in the book. And toward the end of the book, I do address some of the evolving threat issues that we're facing in our country, including politically driven ones, which we've seen a real rise in recent years. This problem has always been around, violent extremism, but I think we're experiencing it in a way now that is certainly heightened. There are other times you can look at in modern history where these things were going on and causing a lot of problems, but there's no doubt we're in a phase like that now. And I think in some ways, January 6th was an extraordinary kind of new version of that. And so the way that ideological extremism and political extremism drives violent attacks and planned violence, whether it's a lone actor or a group or small groups, disparate groups, what have you, this method, behavioral threat assessment, is also potentially a very powerful tool there as well. So I do talk about that some at the end of the book. So we're talking about, I think, potentially a solution that can scale in our country to help with everything from school shootings to, this kind of political violence we see in the streets, or, focusing on elections or focusing on school boards or the pandemic. all of these things intersect in some really interesting and vital ways.
Yeah, and I'm hoping that a lot of the cooperation agreements that we're seeing with some of the more conspiratorial January 6th defendants will add to the body of knowledge on how to utilize behavioral threat assessment to stop these things, and how to understand recruitment techniques and activities. I think it's very important. I know a lot of people are very frustrated with people not going to prison for 10 years. But some of this, I think intelligence is going to be invaluable in how we deal with shootings and extremist violence going forward.
Absolutely. And I think ultimately understanding human behavior. I mean, this is based in behavioral science, this method, and that research is what supports this work. And it's a growing field. And I think with good reason. It's, you know, as much as it's tempting to look at perpetrators of attacks, of mass violence, or of an insurrection as the enemy, or as monsters, or, you know, people we can't relate to, that's really not true. I mean, these are human beings, and if we start to understand their behavior better, we have a better chance of changing it, of preventing it. And that's another theme of this book that I think is really important. It's too easy to get mired in anger and frustration and resignation that things are terrible and they're not going to change. This is very much I think a more constructive approach to some of these problems.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I really appreciate your time today, everybody. The piece in Mother Jones is called "Evidence from Armed Trump Extremists Continues to Emerge in January 6 Cases." And the book is available now for pre-order. It's called Trigger Points. And I appreciate your time today. Mark Follman, thanks for joining me.
Thanks a lot for having me. It's great to talk to you.